Hello everyone and welcome to Class 4 of CIL 201, Intermediate Silhouette Effects. My name's Ben Brownlee and today we are going to be looking at hair. Now before we get into the hair itself, I do want to take a little bit of time to talk about unusual footage sizes. So if we have a look at this one here, we're dealing with anamorphic footage. As you can probably see, everything's looking a little bit squished. If we look up at the top left hand here, we can see that our footage is 1280 by 1047. So this is quite an unusual little resolution. It's because it was shot anamorphically, and the final destination for this is 1280 by 720. But it doesn't really end there, because actually let's pop in and see what's going to be happening with this footage. Now what's actually going to happen is this squeezes down to an anamorphic 1280 by 536. So this is actually the frame as it should be once it's scaled down to the correct size. But our output format is going to be letterboxed 1280 by 720. Now because these are the frames we've been given, it's not our job to come in and start to squeeze everything down just to fit our purposes, to make it easy for us. There's obviously going to be other workflow issues going on, so we have to respect what format is going on here. Now, when working with anamorphic footage, it can be nice to be looking at the frame as it would naturally be, and luckily for us, Silhouette Effects has a way of managing that. So back in Silhouette Effects, if I look in my session settings up here, we can see we've got it's a custom format that's based off of the footage that we're using. So here it's reading in 1280 by 1047. Now we don't want to be playing around with this at all, because that's the size of the frame. But what we can play around with is our pixel aspect ratio here. So if we do a quick division of 1047 by 536, which is the equivalent of the anamorphic when it's stretched out, we get a pixel aspect ratio of approximately 1.95. Now it's also at this stage where we can start to change the frame per second here as well to make it so that it matches our final sequence. You might have noticed that in previous classes I've been working at 25 frames a second. Even though if we take a look up in the project window again, because we've been dealing with image sequences, it's always said at 24 frames a second. So this is the initial speed that it's expecting. If we brought in a QuickTime movie, then it would detect the frames per second from the QuickTime movie and use that as the initial frames per second when we start up our new session. But in this case, because it's an image sequence, it's expecting it to be 24 frames a second here. So in this case, I've changed this to 23.976, which I believe it was going out to. So that's all fine. Hit OK on that. And now I can use actually zoom out a little bit here, and we can see that my footage is now at the correct aspect ratio. And you can see that I've got my little button up here, my AR aspect ratio button, which I can toggle on and off. So we just zoom in just a little bit. So you can find, for fine details, it's going to be worth checking with the aspect ratio turned off at the very end, just to make sure that everything's looking absolutely fine and how it should be. So coming in and changing the session settings for footage one stage at a time, it's all well and good, but we're handling a number of different shots, all with the same pixel aspect ratio and the same size, then that can get a little bit old quite fast. Now, luckily, there is a way of adding new formats to this list down here. So these are our standards that we have installed. And let's cancel that one out. And let's have a look at how we actually add to that list. So we're looking for our resources folder. And on a Mac, it's actually quite tricky to find it. Well, it's not tricky, it's just hidden away. It's much more open on the other platforms. It's not that tricky though. We just have to right click or control click on the application itself and come to show package contents. and we can come in and take a look at our resources folder in here. Cool, so in the resources folder, we're looking for a couple of different files. We're looking first and foremost for our formats.xml file. And let's actually duplicate this, because before I make any copies or any changes to this, I want to keep a backup of the original. So this XML file can just be opened up either in an XML reader or in just a regular text edit application, and this is fairly straightforward and fairly simple to look through. What we're looking at is obviously the bits between the first set of brackets that say format and the closing brackets that say end format here. And let's look for something that almost matches where we're after. So that's probably HDTV 720 here. So if I wanted to make my own version of this, I can just go copy with Control C or Command C and paste Command or Control V. And I'll give it a quick name. Let's call this one 1280 by 1047 Anamorphic. And set my appropriate width and height here. So that is going to be 1047 with my aspect ratio of 1.95 and my frame rate here of 23.976. And what we can also do here, if we have a look at some of the other formats, we can also set up different masks that are available. And what the masks do is it basically brings in a safe area, or it shows in a sort of very graphic way the different crops that we're taking out. So for example, if we're working at 4K, we have various different masks available to us here, and these actually, let's just copy and paste these just to show you what's going to happen on this. Now it's actually not particularly handy or useful in this exact example, but it's probably worth just seeing what happens. So let's just save that out. So file save, we can close it up. Actually, before I do that, if you want to make a custom masks shape as well, we've got an XML here for the various masks. It's these names here which correspond to this mask value over here. So you can take a look down at the SD formats. We've got the safe action mask here, and that's being defined in our masks XML file. So under the top one here, which is cool. All right, so we come back in here. We're not going to see this immediately. So let's just quit and restart Silhouette FX. And open up my recent project, come back to my footage as I had it before, go new session, and it's now going to detect that it's got a format that actually fits this particular frame size, and then fills in the rest of the details afterwards. So I'm just going to call this one test because I'm going to delete it. Zoom out a little bit here, and now I've also got my format masks available up here. So the format masks are going to come in and show me, which areas I need to be looking at much more carefully. This is obviously great for 4K and for the high resolutions where we get the full frame, but we're not going to be asked to roto out right to the edges because obviously it's obviously going to get cropped later. So this is a cool way of just sort of showing us visually what's going on, and that is only available, or the appropriate masks I should say are only available here if in our XML file they're being made available at this point. Cool. Well, let's delete my test here and go back to my original project, which was the girl hair. And let's take a look at this shot. Let's start swinging that back and forth. Because our main focus today is going to be on hair. This is a hot topic, obviously, and there's a number of different ways of looking at hair. And we are going to go through a couple of them. Now, I've got a couple of rules of thumb about hair, about rotoing hair. The first one and the most important one is, if you can avoid it, don't roto it. And what I mean by that is actually not, just deliver back a sort of half-done mask, but use different techniques to extract the hair rather than go in and do the sort of, hard graft of doing the main roto work. So that could be, pulling a key or doing some sort of, procedural mat to get rid of that hard work there. The next rule of thumb is actually, once that bit has failed, it's about figuring out what the sort of lowest level of detail it is. How much you actually genuinely need to roto. How many of the zoom in a little bit. How many of the tiny thin strands do we need to keep in? And that's a question that really comes down to time and money probably. So it's worth getting those questions out of the way first, and so you don't spend hours or maybe even days getting to a stage where the level of detail that you've got in is far in excess of what is actually needed. But for now, let's take a look at what we can start to do with this. So for a lot of this shot, now for a good portion of this, we're probably not going to have to do a lot of roto at all. There seems to be quite a good separation going on between the girl and the background, and that is going to be very useful for us indeed. Now, we haven't really looked at the keying capabilities. Let's come up and edit the session, properties up here, and let's come over to our keyer and just turn that on as well. Now, Silhouette Effects does have a capable keyer built into it. As we go through, we'll probably see a couple of things that we could be wanting a bit more from it. But a lot of the time, this is going to do a huge amount of work for you. So we come over to the node itself, and we have our primary mat here and a secondary mat. And the tools included with those are pretty much the same. So we have a choice of how we start to pull our key. So if we've got blue screen or green screen, we can start to play around with that. Here we do not have either blue screen or green screen. But if I turn on my alpha channel, you can start to see that as soon as I have the keyer turned on, it's going to start to do its magic. And as we have a look down at what else we can start to key, we can also start to key things like luminance, hue saturation. We can look at averages of color channels or the individual color channels here. We can even take a look at the alpha channel or cyan, magenta and yellow channels. And all of these are going to give us, let's turn the alpha back on again. All of these are going to give us some, quite interesting and different starting points to pull our key. Try the color channels first. So let's just turn this back onto blue screen and turn my background all the way out to 100. So that's pretty much removed our alpha channel there. So we can really start to look through the different color channels to see if there's one that is actually a proper standout. So we can just click on there and just see if there's anything between the red, green or blue that is an obvious standout. And to my mind, obviously I think it's going to be the green that is looking the most tasty to begin with. So let's come back and take a look at the green channel here. Now at this stage, I can either turn my alpha channel on and start to have a look there, or we can use the different views that we have over here. So we can have a look at the foreground, background we have none yet, combined mat, primary mat, secondary mat and output. So let's look at our primary mat. And in the first instance, we've really got two controls that we're looking at. We've got our original position. This is really where we start to pull the key in. So we can try and play around with that until we get a good separation between the background and our girl here. And then we also have the range, and this really controls the softness of this. So with our softness or our range set down really low, there's almost no softness. It's pretty much becomes a binary black and white key. And with the range turned up, it adds in that softness up again. So what we're looking for here is obviously trying to get the kind of best separation we can without kind of compromising too many details. The next controls we've got are black clip and white clip. And this really starts to do what it says on the tin. So if we bring the black clip up, it just says that any value lower than 26% black is going to be clipped at black. And in the same way with the white, any value that is less than 30 or 25% white here is going to be clipped totally white here. Now these really are hard clips, so it isn't like a levels command where you can start to keep in some of the sort of grey details here and just sort of increase the contrast. This just clips everything out. So if you're not careful, when you start to try to remove details, you can really get a very, very sort of ratty, raggedy looking key going on here, which doesn't look great. I would tend to try to avoid the clip as much as possible because it just starts to kill some of the details, and I don't really like that. We then have shrink and blur, so we can again sort of, this starts to do a kind of almost like a mini-max kind of effect. So it starts to either expand out the white levels here or expand out in the opposite direction, so the darker levels first, so we can shrink the matte or expand the matte out. We've also got blur going on, so yeah, just a regular straightforward blur. And wrap, which is actually kind of cool, not particularly in this instance here, but it does it's basically doing an inner blur. So it's really cool for getting light wrap stuff going around. So if we had a little green screen going on here, we can key that out, and with our background in the back, with our little, we can really quickly just stick a light wrap in there, make everything look a lot more realistic, just with one little slider there. Here, where we're trying to maintain all this detail, it's not particularly useful. Here, we obviously want to keep the girl in, so I'm just going to invert the matte there. So at this point, we can start to look at our composite. And this is looking a little bit weird again, because it's actually quite difficult to see in great detail, you know, what it is we're keeping in and taking out. We can see actually that we're keeping in quite a lot of the grass here, and obviously, you know, that's right there. That's not great, and we are losing some of the very thin hair here as well. But that becomes very much a judgment call. But really, the only way to start to really find out whether this is working is to see it in context. And if we don't have a full background plate, we can use the same trick as we did in a earlier class and actually bring in our background gradients. and plug that into our background, extend that duration out, come back to our roto, look at the composite, oh sorry, come to our keyer, there we go, look at our composite there, and here we can start to see a better idea of how lacking our keying is at this point, or how unfinished our keying is at this point, I should say. But another thing to do, and if we can, and this goes back to my idea of getting that sort of minimum level of detail, is see if we can get any sort of version of this background plate as it would be in the final comp. So even if it's just something like for a slap comp, you know, that's going to help us out quite a bit. So if I import some new media here, and let's just stick this in the background. And I might need to clear our cache here, purge cache. There we go. And that should now bring in our other shot. So all this is really doing is a very, very quick, very, very dirty slap comp here, just showing the different areas that are going to be replaced. So the idea for this shot is to be able to add some extra flowers and things to the bushes, and also some more details coming on in the grass here. So you can see just actually these little bits and bobs here are very rough, not even tracked in, just animated in with a couple of keyframes, just to give us an idea if we're actually getting the level of detail that we actually need. So we can see here, you know, it's probably going to be okay for a lot of it, because we don't need, for this particular example, we don't need an entirely clean lawn. Most of this can just be garbage matted around away, and a lot of the very fine details here are either not going to be visible properly in the final scene, and at the compositing stage actually get a cleaner key coming up here, or a cleaner mat coming up here, if we need to. You know, even if that's a case of just maybe painting out certain areas. But I'm not, you know, entirely happy. I think we can still do better with this mat here. So let's take a look at what we can do. Let's take a look at our foreground again. Now what we could also benefit from is actually using the secondary mat. So let's come in, take a look at our secondary mat and enable that. And let's take a look at the luminance. Luminance is probably going to be a good one. Saturation, dealing with anything like saturation or even hue, unless you're working on completely uncompressed footage, can be a bit of a gamble, just because most compressed codecs look to the color channels to throw away as much color or as much data as it possibly can, because it's easier to hide that data loss in the color channels. So it's great for when you're just looking through it, but when you're actually coming to try and do any sort of keying based on those particular channels there, if we're not working with the most pristine footage that you can possibly think of, this is where you're going to start to see the problems. But for now, we are going to take a look at luminance. And let's see what I can grab from that. Cool. Now, once I'm happy with that, let's take a look at the combined mat now, and start to see, actually let's invert that, and start to see how we can blend these together, because we can start to blend these in a number of different ways. So screen is going to screen those two and end up with a slightly lighter matte overall than we had previously, or actually either of the two mattes individually. And add is going to give us an even larger result. Multiply and subtract are going to do pretty much the opposite there, and we're going to end up with a darker matte overall. And this is probably this is really where we want to be at this stage. Another way to take a look at it is also to look at lighten and darken, which just takes the lightest or the darkest pixels from either of the two and just displays those. But let's take a look at multiply. That might be a good place to be. Let's see what we can do here. See if there's any little movement we can make now. Just going to bring in a little bit more detail in the fine edges without compromising us too much on the dark. So let's take a look at that in context. I'm looking over here on the left hand side of the hair, and that's probably looking pretty good there, because we've got that nice blend of sort of semi-transparency and also keeping in some of the opacity there. So let's look at the combined matte there, look at the primary matte and secondary matte. Cool, so that's pretty good for the mattes, I reckon. That's got us a nice way of the way there. There's a little bit of stuff we need to fill in still. We need to make sure that this is solid, so we're going to have to create a little simple shape coming in here, covering that little seam. But we are going to have to roto, the main body of the girl anyway. But it's just taken away a whole load of work for us. Except when it comes to the first half of the clip. So the second half, when she becomes free of all these bushes, everything's great. When we've got all these bushes here, our key is pretty much doing nothing for us. So we are in a bit of trouble there. So especially at the first 23 frames, definitely the first 20 frames, where a lot of all this fine hair is all the way stuck in those bushes, we are going to have to roto that up. Cool, so let's come to our roto node now. And see that we're taking all of that in. So here's the fun bit. So let's create a little garbage mask for our girl here. Just going to keep it really, really simple. That's not a fine edge at all. And let's just work that through. As I said, it's just a quick little one there. Just make sure we're not cutting anything off. Yeah, a little bit there. A little bit there as well, so let's Cool, not going to get hung up on that. And then let's take our garbage mask blend mode here and just set that to intersect. Cool. And obviously it's not perfect. We are going to have to, well, we're cutting a bit too much of the box off. But that's easily fixed, and now we have our little garbage mask girl coming in. So that's cool. So that's pretty good from around about probably frame 35 onwards. So let's actually just set our work range now, just to frame 35. Alright, but so we can concentrate directly on the hair, I'm going to turn off the keyer for now. So I can just come up to the little enable button up here, turn that off, come back down to my roto shape. And because my garbage mask is actually intersected with nothing, I can turn that off as well. Let's just come to our foreground now and start to work our little magic with this. So when it comes to rotoing hair, we're going to deal with this in the way that we've dealt with a lot of the other roto work. So we do our traffic light system, we stop, analyze the footage, really see where the individual shapes are coming in, and then sort of start to proceed from there. So we've got a lovely little moving camera, and I really just want to take out that movement just to make that roto as easy as possible. We've also got, if we take a little look here, we've got actually a large amount of head which isn't moving or doing anything particularly interesting. Small movements going on just in the main head here, but mainly for a lot of it, it's the camera motion that's doing the main work for us. Obviously the girl's walking out, so there's a small change happening there. So we've got this big generally static areas coming on here. Then if we look at the pigtails, we can actually start to break down different shapes that are going into building up our edges, and some of these are moving more than others. So we've got this top bit of the pigtail here which isn't really moving all that much. Then we've got this second sort of wave coming in here, which is moving a little bit more. And then as it gets further and further away into these little strands, those are the ones that are moving the most. So it's trying to start to identify now which shapes are going to make up our edges and see how simple we can make those. Because we've got quite a bit of stuff that is moving here. So let's look at the right ponytail, or sorry, the right pigtail. That's moving quite a lot. But most of that movement, especially in the middle, is being hidden by the rest of the hair coming in here. So there's no point doing a huge complex shape for this side of the pigtail when we can easily start to break that down into lots of smaller shapes. But first things first, let's get our camera stabilize done first. So create a new layer, call this camera stabilize, and let's track this in. Let's find a good starting place to track. We've got a couple of obvious areas. If we're just trying to stabilize our position, we've got quite a good shape coming in here for the center of the head, which is going to be nice to track in. But there is a bit of rotation and scale which I'd like to take out as well. So let's see what we can get done with these little hair bands. I'm a little bit concerned already simply because if we take a look back at this in full speed, some of these are moving independently. They're not quite sitting flat on the same plane, so they are moving a little bit, so that could throw our tracker off a little bit. Maybe not the tracker, but the result anyway. Let's see how we can get on. So let's start with this one. We've done this quite a few times now, so let's come in, find the best channel. It's going to be the red channel. Pretty much guarantee it. It's a red hairband. Blur it up a little bit, sharpen it up a whole load. Just give us a bit more detail. I doubt contrast is going to help us. It's not. Touch a little bit in there, but yeah, it's not going to help us too much. And denoise we don't really need. It's not particularly noisy footage. Let's take our behavior from the start frame and tolerance up to 75 and see how we get on. Seems to be holding fairly steady, so let's just play that through. Yep. Cool. And let's take the second one. Let's find a place where it's sharp. It's going to be there. Try and find something on a similar plane. That's really important. If we're taking out any sort of rotation or scale footage, or scale tracking data, it needs to be properly on the same plane. Otherwise, it's going to send us off completely in the wrong direction. Let's see how we get on with this. I've got a horrible feeling. Let's take that in a little bit. Sort of feeling some of this shape here is actually hair, but let's see what that's doing. It's holding pretty good as well. Cool. Not going to argue with that. And let's have all of those selected and my camera stabilize rotation, scaling and position. Come back into the transform, turn my stabilize on up the top there, see how we got on. Now the cool thing is, if we've got this right, I can move this over here into the center. If we've got this right, this should stay nicely centered. And do you know what? It's not too bad. There's a couple of juddery points, especially at the beginning. And it's turned or rotated a little bit from here. So this is the cool thing actually about having all the transform data, all the tracking data in this matrix here, because it's actually now separate to the rest of the anchor position, scale and rotation. So if I come into my rotate here, come in and find out where that's most wrong. It's probably that one there. Turn the stabilize off because it's going to drive me mad trying to compensate for that. We can come in and add some small, really what's going to amount to adjustment keyframes. Get that looking proper. Cool, and that should be pretty nice. Yeah. So that's taken out loads of that movement that I really wasn't all that keen on. So let's dump all of these right at the bottom. Here, so the tracker there. Duplicate up, copy and paste that camera stabilizer and bring that up the top. And rename this one Girl Hair. Let's just call that Girl Hair. And let's bring this in now. So let's create our first shape. Start with the X-splines here. Start with somewhere sharp, which is probably going to be on frame 8. Cool, and just get our first shape, which is going to be for the head. So for the main sort of skull. Now she's really not moving or doing any sort of crazy motion with her head, so that we can get away with doing just one big skull piece here, and we won't really have to do too much adjustment to this one main shape, I hope. Main skull. Turn our stabilize on. Just check that through. Little bit of drift there where she looks like she lifts her head up. So we're cool up till there. There it starts getting a little tricky. I can see I've actually already got a problem with the big shape. I've gone out a little bit too wide on that area there, but that's no problem. Let's just hit the multi-frame. Just reshape that. Fix it early enough, it's not going to be an issue. Probably just, actually, let's just adjust that. Just adjust that up there so that we keep it nice and simple. We can have another shape coming in for the neck. There we go, no props. And we drift off there again, back into my transform. Actually, in this case, it's actually not even a case of drifting off. It's the natural movement going on with the head as it's lifted up. So we can see more. We can actually see more skull. As it goes back down again, we can see less. Cool, very straightforward. Nice. So let's take a look at the next bit, which is going to be the start of the pigtails. Probably even before the pigtails, it's going to be the what they call the bunches here. So it's going to be this bunch here. And just see how much that changes shape. A little bit. So let's come in, create another to my overlay on. Lock my skull up. Come in and do a little shape for the bunch. Keep my areas overlapping. I need to just reshape that there. So I'm just tightening up my point by holding down Option and then dragging that over. Be good to get a nicer point from the get-go. Turn my overlay on, but turn the alpha bit off. I'm even going to delete that keyframe there because I'm not happy, even though it's the initial keyframe, I'm not happy with how it's gone in relation to the rest of them. Cool, we've now got to fill in the rest of that, but let's leave that for the for later. So let's come in and we will call this right, what do we decide this was called? Call it a bunch. And let's look at the hair itself here. So let's find that sharp frame. Love dealing with the motion blur as well. And that's probably going to be frame 8, yep. And let's start to now break down our hair here. Come in, actually make another X-spline. And just look at how we can start to find the edges, or the main edge of our hair here. I know I need to add another one for the rest of the bunch there, but that's going to be quite a decent little shape. Most of it. Now I'm looking for the hard edge. Let's turn my overlays off for a second. I'm holding Shift or pressing Shift and A here just to toggle on the alpha there. So what I'm looking for here is the hard edge of the hair. I'm not worried about the individual strands yet. That will come later. So once I've got that in place, then we can start to bring this in. Start to animate this up. Actually here it's probably cool up until frame 3. And then it looks like my tracking is not 100%. Probably going to need to reshape that. Hit R to reshape. Cool, and here it's looking fine. So that's frame 16. And then again, something is going to happen now as this bunch moves further in. I'm going to have to transform that area up here. So still, all the while, trying to maintain this edge here. Cool, so let's look at that. Didn't rotate right to the end, so it's getting a little bit fun. Let's only just look at up to frame 29 now. So we'll get this party going. Of course, that's the top edge here. Now I need to look at this edge coming down here. So let's see where we can start to find the next big main shape. Again, not looking at strands of hair, I'm looking for the main edge. So probably this big bit here. So it's going to be this bit here. Rename this right top. Lock that up. Looks like that could be a good shape now. Just tighten that edge up a little bit. So the reason I like working with the X splines much more than Bezier splines for this sort of stuff is simply because when we start to make bigger, more complex shapes, things, especially with the handles on the Bezier splines, that starts to get a little bit tricky. Of course, now with minimum fuss, we're starting to build up that hair. I can see one of the strands has started to pop through a little bit there, so it's time to just bring that in. Yeah, if we turn on motion blur on all of this stuff now and turn that on the node as well. It's going to start to make a bit of a difference, and it's also going to start to identify a little hole here. That's not what I want. Let's do a multi-frame on this again, just do a reshape. Just add a little point in there, just alt click in there just to add the point in. Cool. So once we've got the main areas in, and obviously I haven't finished off the main areas there, but once we've got those main areas in, we can start to look at the larger strands of hair. So this is where things start getting a bit more fun. So we'll lock that up as well. Cool, so let's look at this particular curl here and see what that's doing. Because what we're looking for are shapes that are remaining consistent or relatively consistent throughout the entire piece. So we can do simple shapes. For example, this one's a fairly straightforward little shape here. Turn my overlays back on. Tie that in there into the main hair. So we've got that main piece of hair coming in here. going to a point, but even try to keep the shapes fairly loose. And let's colour code this up a little bit, make it a bit easier to identify later on. And we're still stabilised up, so let's come in and look at what this hair is meant to be doing. And if we've chosen the right hair, or the right general shape, and we've got our tracking looking pretty cool, there should be a minimum or minimal amount of work that actually needs to be done. And usually that's going to be of the distortion, if it's moving away or towards us, or it's going to be rotation if it's just bouncing up and down, or a combination. And here it's moving quite a lot, so it's going to move up, and we'll distort it. And let's call this lock 1. Oh, right. Lock 1. There we go. So it looks a bit, incongruous when we've got fairly sharp edges going on with the hair. So we can just sort of blur this up. Just even a point, and that will just help to sell it. We can just even do an inner blur as well if you want to. If we've rotoed to the hard edge, just do a bit of an inner blur. Instead of the centered blur. So background back to none, set that back to composite and just have a little look at that, turn the overlays off. So we can really see the difference between inner blur and centered blur there. So you just choose whichever one is suitable for you. Cool, so looking back at our output, there's probably only one other main type of a thing to look at when we're doing the hair. And this is similar actually to what we did with the chimp. And that's coming in and using open splines. And this is, stabilise that up so we can see it a bit better. There we go. So these little ones here, if we're starting to really talk about those, if we've got loads of these coming in, it's going to take quite a bit of time to get those done. So it's worth figuring out right at the beginning if it's even necessary to come in and get this sort of level of detail or not. Because if it's not, great, just don't do it. It's not worth the time. So here we're going to come in, find our strand of hair. Actually, let's take this hair instead. It's coming all the way down there. And then we can just hit escape. We can start to blur this up, or sorry, stroke this up. So we turn on the overlays and the alpha channel with the shift A. We start to get a little bit there. So I am going to call this hair strand. Right, strand 1. It's going to be really difficult to identify these in any other way than looking at colour. So that is definitely going to be the way to go. If you've got loads and loads of different strands, setting colour is the only way that you're going to be able to ever have any hope of finding it. And again, the cool thing is about these strands, hopefully a lot of work has been done for you with regards to the main transform And there's going to be a huge amount of guesswork, especially when things start to get a little bit dicey. Just try and keep it consistent right up until the point where you can't see it, and then even then just rotate it consistently until you can start to see it again. So it's actually kind of cool to sort of leave it off, or not leave it off, but just find the areas here we've got no chance of seeing where it actually is meant to be going. But there is some chance at a later stage, a later frame, like here, where we pick it up again. I'm going to have to reshape this one. So it's really using just intelligent guesswork. Because you know what, if you're wrong, and you're consistently wrong, that's kind of cool as well. So for loads of that stuff, there was absolutely no chance of ever being able to figure out where that was coming from. As I start to blur this up just a wee bit, take the stabilize off. We can start to see if it's consistent or not. If anything, it's far too thick. Cool. Well, that's the general idea for your hair. So we've got the different types. Wherever possible, let's actually just come back and take this as far out as possible. Avoid rotoring, so we can use the key instead, which is what we did here. Yes, wherever possible, we're going to start to use the key. So let's just keyframe the opacity of these ones on and off for a second. Select all. Turn those on there. Cool, and set the girl hair to combine there. Cool. Yes, wherever possible, we're going to start to use the key to take out the main bit. When that's not possible, we're going to be in for a bit of a treat, getting the different sort of roto shapes going on here. So the order is, get the big stuff done first, the big immovable stuff, then start to look at the edges, then build up the big locks, and then build in the strands if you need to. And all of this is going to be made a hell of a lot easier just by using a decently stabilized plate. Now, if any of you fancy completing the first 30 frames, that'd be great. Remember to post it in the forums so we can all take a look at it, or any other questions that you may have. But I'm Ben Brownlee. Thanks for joining me for another week. I'll see you again soon.